Imagine being present at the Temple of Jerusalem, one of the most sacred places on earth, an imposing space where the presence of God was revered with awe and admiration. At the heart of this grand building, protected by a holy barrier, was the Holy of Holies, the place where, according to Jewish tradition, the Creator himself would manifest. What few understand is that this was not just a restricted area. It was a living symbol of the separation between the divine and the human, an invisible boundary that dictated the relationship between God and his people. And this boundary was physically represented by an imposing veil, a curtain of unusual thickness, whose function was not merely decorative, but profoundly spiritual. The veil of the temple was not just a simple piece of fabric. It had a colossal dimension, according to historical accounts, standing about 18 meters high and up to 10 centimeters thick. Made of the finest linen in shades of blue, purple, and crimson, it was embroidered with cherubs, the same celestial beings that, according to tradition, guarded the entrance to Eden. This monumental curtain separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, indicating that the divine presence was inaccessible to the common man. Only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest was allowed to cross this barrier, carrying with him the blood of the sacrifice to intercede for the people's sins. This physical separation was not an architectural detail, but a concrete representation of humanity's spiritual condition. Sin was seen as an insurmountable barrier, a wall that prevented any direct proximity with God. For centuries, the Israelites lived under this reality, believing that the only way to approach the Creator was through the Levitical priesthood and ritual sacrifices. The veil, therefore, was a constant reminder that God was present, but inaccessible. Religion established strict rules to protect divine holiness, and any attempt to cross this boundary could result in instant death. But this concept did not emerge in Judaism in isolation. The idea of a separation between the human and the divine is found in various ancient cultures. In Egypt, for example, the pharaohs were considered the only intermediaries between the gods and the people. In Greece, the oracles spoke on behalf of the gods, but only under specific conditions. What distinguished Judaism was the notion of a single God, whose presence was real and active, but who, at the same time, remained hidden behind a barrier imposed by the religious system itself. Within this context, the veil was not just a piece of fabric, but a symbolic fortress. It established a dependency relationship between the people and the priestly caste. To approach God, a mediator was necessary, someone holy enough to withstand the divine presence without being consumed. The high priest himself, when entering the Holy of Holies, had to follow a strict purification protocol, as any failure could be fatal. According to some rabbinic accounts, he would enter with a rope tied to his ankle, so that should he die in the presence of the divine, he could be removed without another daring to enter. This system created a structure of religious power based on exclusivity. Access to the divine was a privilege restricted to a few, and this reality persisted for centuries. The temple was the center of the Jewish faith, and its functioning revolved around the rites that maintained this separation. For many, this barrier was necessary as it reinforced God's sanctity and human frailty. But for others, it represented an obstacle that hindered a more direct and intimate relationship with the Creator. And then, something extraordinary happened. At the exact moment when Jesus gave up his spirit on the cross, that thick and impenetrable veil was torn from top to bottom. It wasn't a human action. There was no intervention from priests or believers. God himself dismantled the barrier that separated his people from his presence. Imagine the impact of this event. The priests who were in the temple at that moment must have been in shock. The separation that had been maintained for generations had disappeared in an instant. But what did this act really mean? If the veil symbolized the barrier between God and men, its breaking indicated a radical transformation in the way humanity would relate to the divine. The old system of sacrifices and priestly mediation was being abolished. Religion, as an intermediary of spiritual experience, was being challenged at its core. What Jesus did by dying was not just a historical event. It was a complete redefinition of what it means to connect with God. He was inaugurating a new era in which anyone could approach the Creator without the need for complex rituals or a human intermediary. The final sacrifice had been made, and the relationship between heaven and earth would never be the same again. This event would echo throughout the centuries, redefining not only the Christian faith, but the entire structure of human religiosity. The torn veil was an act of liberation, but also an invitation, a call for each individual to understand that there are no more barriers between them and God, except for those they choose to maintain. With this initial understanding about the temple's veil, we can now move forward to an even more fascinating moment: the exact instant when the veil tore and what it represented for those who witnessed this event. The scene was distressing. At the top of Golgotha, Jesus, suspended on the cross, felt the weight of human suffering in his exhausted body. Darkness covered the land, an eerie silence hung over Jerusalem. The Messiah, discredited by the religious, humiliated by the Romans, and abandoned by the crowd that once exalted him, was about to utter his last words. And then, in the final moment, a cry echoed through the heavens: "It is finished." At the same moment, something supernatural happened in the heart of the temple. In the Holy of Holies, where no ordinary person could enter, the immense veil separating God from men began to tear, not from bottom to top, as if it were a human action, but from top to bottom. The sound of the thick curtain splitting was terrifying. The priests who were in the temple witnessed the impossible. Something that should never happen was happening before their eyes. The sacred barrier, maintained for centuries, was being destroyed. What did this mean? This moment was so impactful that it is described in 3 of the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew 27:50-51 narrates, "And Jesus, crying out again with a loud voice, yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split." The synchronicity of these events was not a coincidence. Something tremendous was happening not only in the physical world, but in the spiritual one. The priests who had spent years within that sacred place were astounded. Imagine the panic. The Holy of Holies was a place where only the high priest could enter once a year, and now it was exposed. What would happen? Would God's presence consume everyone? Had it become a profane place? None of them could explain. But the impact of this event was not confined to the temple. The earthquake that accompanied the tearing of the veil caused stones to split and tombs to open. The very environment responded to the sacrifice that had just been consummated. It was not an ordinary man who died on that cross, but someone whose act changed the structure of the spiritual universe. Even a Roman centurion, accustomed to the brutality of war and execution, was taken aback and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. But why did the veil tear precisely at that moment? What had Jesus done for this event to occur with such precision? The answer lies in the relationship between his death and the old religious system. For centuries, the Jewish people lived under the Mosaic covenant, based on laws, sacrifices, and a rigid priestly hierarchy. Sin could only be atoned for through the shedding of animal blood and the intercession of priests. But this system was about to be replaced by something greater. The letter to the Hebrews, written years later, explains the meaning of this event. "We have full confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way that he opened for us through the veil, that is, his body." Hebrews 10:19-20. The torn veil was not just a physical phenomenon, it was the visible representation of what had occurred in the spiritual world. Christ's sacrifice had opened a new path of direct access to God. This means that at that moment, the role of the priests as mediators was being undone. The temple system, which relied on continuous sacrifices and an exclusive priestly caste, was no longer necessary. Christ was now the eternal high priest, the only intermediary between God and men. No human being would need to submit to religious rituals to find the Creator. This connection was now available to everyone, without restrictions. The importance of this event did not go unnoticed. The very religious leaders of Jerusalem recognized the threat it posed to their authority. If people could connect directly with God, without needing the temple and the priests, what would happen to their influence? This question would become even more evident in the following years, when Christianity would begin to spread, challenging the spiritual monopoly of the religious elite. Another striking detail is that, about 40 years later, the Temple of Jerusalem itself would be destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. This fact further reinforces the idea that the religious system based on the temple had been replaced. Jesus had prophesied this destruction, warning that the true place of worship would no longer be a physical building, but the hearts of the believers. The hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. John 4:23. From this moment on, faith would no longer be defined by sacred places or fixed rituals. The relationship with God would not depend on stone temples, but on the intimate and personal connection between the Creator and each individual. This was the true meaning of the torn veil. But this event did not remain solely in the past. Even today, many people live as if the veil had never been torn. They create barriers between themselves and God, believing that they need intermediaries, rules, or institutions to reach the divine. But the message of the torn veil continues to be an invitation. The door to God's presence is open. There is no more separation. The access is free. In light of this revelation, an even deeper question arises. What did this event symbolically represent, and how did it completely redefine the way we understand God's presence? This is exactly what we will explore in Part 3, the spiritual symbolism behind the torn veil. The torn veil was not just a physical event. Its spiritual significance was a revolution that completely redefined the way humanity related to God. Throughout history, the concept of separation between the divine and the human has always been present in various cultures. From imposing temples to exclusive priests, there has always been a structure indicating that the common man could not directly access the sacred. But at that moment when the veil of the Jerusalem temple was torn from top to bottom, a truth was revealed. The barrier separating God and men was forever undone. To understand the magnitude of this, it is essential to comprehend what this veil represented. It was not just a curtain, but a symbol of the separation between God and humanity. Its presence in the temple reinforced the idea that the Creator was inaccessible, distant, and reserved only for those who underwent specific rituals. However, this separation was not created by God, but by man himself, who over the centuries developed religions based on fear, control, and the need for intermediaries to establish a connection with the divine. When torn, the veil carried a clear message. Access to the presence of God was now open to all. Jesus not only died to pay for the sins of humanity, but also to remove any barrier that prevented a direct relationship with the Creator. His death marked the end of the religious system that relied on rules, sacrifices, and human mediations. Now each individual could enter the presence of God without fear, without restrictions, and without the need for an earthly priest to intercede. But there is an even deeper detail in this symbolism. The torn veil itself can be understood as the body of Christ. In Hebrews 10:20 we read, "By the new and living way that He consecrated for us, through the veil, that is, through His flesh." In other words, Jesus' body was broken in the same way the veil was torn. Just as the temple curtain prevented access to the Holy of Holies, the barrier of sin prevented man from approaching God. But by being broken on the cross, Jesus opened a new path, a path of life, freedom, and direct communion with the Father. This symbolism directly connects with the concept of redemption. For centuries, the Jewish people lived under Mosaic law, which required constant sacrifices for the atonement of sins. Each year, on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies to offer blood on behalf of the people. But these sacrifices were never enough. They only temporarily covered the sins. With the death of Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice was made. There was no longer a need for continuous offerings, because the price had been paid once and for all. Another powerful aspect of this symbolism is the end of the concept of physical temples as exclusive places of God's presence. Until that point, the Temple of Jerusalem was considered God's dwelling on earth. People traveled long distances to worship Him there, because they believed His presence was confined to that sacred space. However, by tearing the veil, God was making it clear that He would no longer dwell in temples made by human hands. The true temple was now the human being itself. Each person who accepted the new covenant would become the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit. This idea was revolutionary. In the past, temples have always been the foundation of organized religion. In Egypt, Babylon, Greece, and Rome, deities were worshipped in grand temples, and only trained priests could approach the gods. Judaism maintained this tradition, but Christ came to break this structure. The torn veil announced that the era of institutionalized religion was coming to an end. Access to God no longer depended on specific locations, rites, or human hierarchies. It was available to anyone, anywhere. This raises a fundamental question. If the veil was torn, why do so many people still live as if it were intact? Even in modern times, many still seek spiritual intermediaries, believe they need to follow strict rules, or feel unworthy of approaching God. This happens because the greatest veil is not the one that existed in the temple. It's the veil that exists in people's minds and hearts. This is the last barrier that needs to be removed. Jesus has already torn the physical veil, but each person needs to choose to accept this truth. As long as we believe that we need intermediaries, or that we are not worthy of approaching God, we are mentally rebuilding the veil that has already been destroyed. The true call of the torn veil is an invitation to spiritual freedom, an invitation to abandon guilt, fear, and the idea that God is distant. The central question that remains is, if Jesus paved the way, why do many still hesitate to cross it? This leads us to an essential point. How did the early Christians interpret this event, and how did it impact the emerging faith? The death of Jesus and the tearing of the veil in the temple were not just isolated events. They were a transition point, a moment that divided history into before and after. For the early Christians, this event was not seen merely as a physical phenomenon, but as a direct message from God. The time of the old covenant had ended, and a new spiritual reality was being inaugurated. But how did those who witnessed these events interpret this sign? And more importantly, how did it influence the formation of early Christianity? The first and most fundamental interpretation was that Jesus' sacrifice had abolished the need for the temple rituals. Until that moment, the Jews followed a system of atonement based on animal sacrifices and the role of priests as intermediaries between God and the people. But when the veil was torn, it became clear that this system was no longer necessary. For the followers of Christ, that event was a sign that the true sacrifice had been made, and it was enough forever. This would explain why, even before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, many Christians had already stopped participating in sacrificial rituals. They understood that Jesus was the ultimate high priest, and that his death replaced any other sacrifice. As Hebrews 9:12 explains, Christ entered the Holy of Holies once for all, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, and obtained eternal redemption. This meant that access to God no longer depended on the temple, but on faith in Christ. But this understanding did not come without resistance. For the religious leaders of the time, this idea was a direct threat to their system. If sacrifices were no longer necessary, then the Levitical priesthood lost its function. If the veil had been torn, then the temple was no longer the exclusive place of God's presence. This change was so radical that it sparked an intense conflict between the early Christians and the Jewish religious elite. The apostles quickly realized the magnitude of this change. Paul, who had previously persecuted Christians precisely because he considered them a threat to Judaism, began to teach that now, each believer was a living temple. In 1 Corinthians 3:16-17, he wrote, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?" This concept was revolutionary. Access to God was no longer restricted to a sacred building. God now dwelt within each person who accepted the new covenant. This also meant that the power structure within the faith needed to change. In the old system, only the priests held spiritual authority. But with the veil torn, everyone had direct access to God. This led to the concept of the priesthood of all believers, a notion strongly advocated by Peter, who wrote, "You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own special people." 1 Peter 2:9. This new understanding caused a rupture between Christians and traditional Judaism. While Jews continued to regard the temple as the center of faith, followers of Christ began to see Jesus as the living temple himself, the true bridge between God and men. This led early Christians to stop relying on sacred places and physical rituals and start living their faith in a more free and personal way. Over time, this view began to spread, and the idea that God was accessible to all became one of the main foundations of Christianity. It no longer mattered whether someone was Jewish or Gentile, priest or layperson, man or woman. Everyone had the same access to God through Jesus. This was one of the reasons why Christianity grew so rapidly. It did not require people to follow a strict religious system, but offered something no other religion offered: a direct relationship with the Creator, without barriers, without intermediaries, without veils. Another interesting point is that the early Christians did not try to rebuild the veil, neither physically nor symbolically. They knew that it was not an accident, but an intentional act of God. However, over the centuries, many religions have tried to restore the concept of separation between God and man. New structures emerged, new hierarchies, new veils of spirituality that prevented people from experiencing this total freedom. The torn veil was not just a past event, it still holds meaning today. Each time someone believes they need a human intermediary to speak with God, or that they can only experience the divine presence within a physical temple, they are mentally reconstructing the veil that Christ has already destroyed. The true message of this event is an invitation to freedom. God is already accessible, now and always. Just step in. Now that we understand how the early Christians interpreted the torn veil, an even more provocative question arises. If Jesus abolished the need for intermediaries, why do so many religions still insist on them? Since the dawn of humanity, the relationship between the divine and humans has been mediated by figures of spiritual authority. Priests, shamans, gurus, prophets, and religious leaders have assumed the role of intermediaries between the Creator and creation. For most civilizations, this structure seemed natural and inevitable. After all, how could an ordinary human being approach something so sacred and powerful? But when the veil of the temple was torn at the moment of Jesus' death, this logic was challenged and completely dismantled. The veil symbolized this separation. It represented a system based on rules, rituals, and the need for someone holier who could intercede for others. But when it was torn from top to bottom, it became clear that this barrier no longer existed. The presence of God was no longer restricted to a sacred space or a special caste of priests. It was available to everyone, everywhere, and at any time. This truth was so radical that it challenged the entire structure of organized religions. If anyone can speak with God directly, then what would be the need for priests, temples, or specific rituals? If the divine presence itself is no longer confined to a physical place, then why rely on religious authorities to access it? The answer is simple. Religions have always thrived on the concept of separation. If we look at history, we will see that all institutional religions are based on the idea that the average person cannot connect directly with the divine. This access has always been conditioned by obedience to certain rules, participation in rituals, and the mediation of religious leaders. In ancient Egypt, only the priests could enter the temples and perform the sacred rites. In Hinduism, the Brahmins were responsible for communicating with the gods. In medieval Catholicism, only priests could interpret the scriptures and conduct the sacraments. But when Jesus surrendered his spirit and the veil was torn, he was declaring that no human being needed a religious mediator to connect with God anymore. The true access was no longer conditioned to temples, sacrifices, or human priesthoods. The only mediator now was Christ, and he had already done everything that was necessary. This was one of the greatest challenges the apostles faced when spreading the gospel message. They were not just announcing a new faith, but proclaiming the end of religions based on intermediaries. It was no longer necessary to go to Jerusalem to encounter God's presence. There was no longer a need to offer sacrifices to obtain forgiveness. Salvation and a relationship with God were available to anyone who simply believed. Paulo explained this reality clearly in 1 Timothy 2:5. For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. This statement was a direct blow against all religions that relied on intermediaries. If Jesus was the only mediator, then any other religious system that required a priest or spiritual leader to grant access to God was outdated. This idea was not well received by those who held religious power. Jewish leaders saw this as a threat to their authority, for without the temple and the priesthood, their dominion over the people's faith would disappear. Centuries later, the Catholic Church itself would revisit this model, establishing a clergy system that functioned as a new priestly caste, reintroducing the separation between God and the faithful through sacraments controlled by the institution. Even in modern times, many religions and Christian denominations still attempt to rebuild the veil, creating new barriers between God and man. They establish rules to define who can or cannot approach the Creator. They demand specific rituals, mandatory participation, and the recognition of human authorities to validate people's faith. This shows that despite Christ having torn the veil 2,000 years ago, many still insist on sewing it back together. But the original Christianity was not about following a religion. It was about living a real and direct experience with God. Jesus did not come to establish a new religious institution, but to restore the connection between God and humanity. His sacrifice was an act of liberation, not just from sin, but also from the religious structures that enslaved people. This raises a profound question. If the veil has been torn and the path has been opened, why do so many people still live as if there were a barrier? The answer lies in the mindset. The real prison is not physical, it's spiritual and psychological. Many people have been taught from an early age to believe that they need an intermediary to connect with God. They have been conditioned to think that only religious leaders have the authority to interpret the scriptures, pray effectively, or grant access to the divine presence. This kind of mindset keeps people bound to a system that was abolished centuries ago. But the true message of the torn veil is an invitation to spiritual freedom. There are no more walls, no more obstacles, no more separation. The presence of God is now available to everyone without restrictions. This understanding has profound implications for spiritual life. It calls us to abandon dependence on human intermediaries and seek a personal and direct relationship with God. It means that we no longer need temples, rituals, or rules imposed by institutions to experience the divine presence. The true temple now is the heart of each believer. This revelation, however, also demands responsibility. If there are no longer human priests to intercede for us, then we are called to take on our spiritual role actively. We can no longer outsource our faith or our pursuit of the divine. We need to live this freedom fully, without fear, and without ties. The torn veil is a reminder that religious control can no longer imprison us, unless we choose to remain trapped. Now that we understand the impact of the torn veil on the concept of religion and spiritual mediation, a crucial question arises. How has this event influenced the course of human history and shaped the paths of civilization? When the veil of the Jerusalem temple was torn, something much larger than a religious symbol was destroyed. The event not only dismantled a spiritual barrier, but also altered the course of human history. The impact of this moment reverberated through the centuries, touching all spheres of civilization, from religion to politics, from culture to philosophy, from the way we see God to the way we understand our own identity. The first major change occurred in Judaism and in the ancient practice of sacrifices. Before the torn veil, the Temple of Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish faith, and the practice of sacrifices was essential for the purification of the people. But surprisingly, just a few decades later, in 70 AD, the temple itself was destroyed by the Romans, definitively ending the sacrificial system. The Jews, who depended on the temple for atonement of sins, had to redefine their faith, relying more on the teachings of the Torah and prayer than on animal sacrifices. For the early Christians, this event confirmed that the era of the temple had ended. Jesus had already announced that this would happen when he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." John 2:19. He was not talking about a stone building, but about himself. Early Christianity understood that the true temple of God was not a physical place, but the community of believers itself, guided by the Holy Spirit. This concept of faith without temples revolutionized religion and shaped the principles of Christianity. From this point on, the presence of God was not restricted to a sacred place, but available to anyone, anywhere. This thought was essential for Christianity to spread throughout the ancient world, reaching not only Jews but also Gentiles, something that would be unthinkable in a system based on the temple. Another profound impact of the torn veil was in the redefinition of religious authority. Before Christ, priests and religious leaders had absolute dominion over the people's faith. They were the ones who decided how and when people could approach God. But with the torn veil, this hierarchy lost its function. The new faith was based on a completely revolutionary principle. Everyone could have a direct relationship with God without the need for human intermediaries. This shift paved the way for universal priesthood, where each person was responsible for their own spiritual journey. As Peter later wrote, "You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people." 1 Peter 2:9. This had a direct impact on the Western world. For centuries, religions maintained their authority by controlling access to the divine. But the idea that each individual could seek God for themselves planted the seed of freedom of conscience, something that much later would influence the Protestant Reformation and even democratic values. In philosophy and politics, the notion that every human being has value and direct access to the divine helped shape the principles of equality and individual rights. The belief that God was accessible to all without distinction challenged power structures that were based on the privilege of a few. The idea of the torn veil inspired a revolt against oppressive religious systems, served as the foundation for humanist thought, and helped shape the concept of freedom that would later be reflected in political revolutions. Movements such as the Enlightenment and modern democracy were only possible because the view of a God exclusive to an elite was replaced by a God accessible to all. However, despite this transformative impact, the spirit of the torn veil still encounters resistance. Even in today's world, many try to recreate barriers between God and humanity. Churches and religions continue to impose intermediaries, rituals, and rules that make people believe there is still a separation between them and the Creator. This leads us to a fundamental question. If Jesus tore the veil, why do so many people still live as if it were intact? Why do we insist on structures that distance us from a direct connection with God? To better understand this reality, we need to explore how the concept of the torn veil connects with humanity's pursuit of truth and spirituality. Since the dawn of humanity, human beings have always sought answers to fundamental questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What happens after death? How do we connect with the divine? Religions arose as attempts to organize these answers, creating structures, dogmas, and rituals that helped people feel close to God. However, over time, many of these same religions began to impose barriers instead of liberating. The veil in the Temple of Jerusalem symbolized this spiritual barrier. It represented the idea that God was distant, inaccessible, separated from humanity by a layer of rituals, sacrifices, and intermediaries. Only a small elite was allowed to enter his presence. But when the veil was torn, this separation was eliminated. The Creator was never really far away. It was just the human system that created this illusion. This event was more than a religious sign. It was an invitation for humanity to awaken to a new spiritual reality. The great message of the torn veil is that truth is not hidden behind dogmas or intermediaries. It has always been accessible to those who sincerely wish to seek it. But why then do so many people still live as if there was a barrier between them and God? The answer lies in fear. For centuries, religions have taught that closeness to God requires suffering, sacrifice, and approval from human authorities. Many have grown up believing that they are not worthy of a direct relationship with the divine, that they need to follow strict rules or receive permission from spiritual leaders to access this connection. This mindset creates a new veil, not physical, but psychological and spiritual. But what if this barrier is just an illusion, and if the torn veil signifies that God's presence was never limited to temples, doctrines, or hierarchies? This is the true spiritual revolution that Christ brought. He didn't come to establish a new religion. He came to destroy the barriers that prevented humanity from seeing the truth. This means that the true spiritual quest is not about following a set of rules or belonging to a specific tradition, but about experiencing the divine presence in a personal and real way. It means understanding that the connection with God does not only happen in temples or churches, but within each person, in the silence of the soul, in the purity of the heart, in the practice of love and compassion. This understanding deeply resonates within various spiritual traditions throughout history. Jesus himself said that the kingdom of God was not in an external place, but within each one, Luke 17:21. Christian mystics, such as John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, taught that the journey to God is an inward journey. Buddha asserted that enlightenment is within one's own being, not outside. Islamic Sufism speaks of the direct union of the soul with the divine, without the need for external rituals. All these ideas point to the same truth. The veil has already been torn, but it's up to each individual to decide if they want to cross over to the other side. However, this spiritual freedom also requires responsibility. When people discover that there are no more barriers, they can no longer outsource their faith or blame religious leaders for their own choices. The pursuit of truth becomes something personal. Each individual must decide to what extent they want to deepen their connection with the divine. That is why many prefer to stay in the safety of institutionalized religion. It's more comfortable to follow a set of external rules than to dive into one's soul and confront the deepest truths. The real challenge of the torn veil is the call for an authentic spiritual awakening, where each person has to take the lead in their own journey. And this leads us to an even more unsettling question. Could it be that, even after 2,000 years, modern religions still impose invisible veils on their followers? The veil was torn, the path was opened. God's presence became accessible to all. But the big question we must ask is, has humanity truly accepted this freedom? Or do we still live as if the veil were intact? In theory, Christianity should have embraced this truth and lived according to this new spiritual reality. However, what we see in practice is that, over the centuries, many religious groups have rebuilt new barriers, new hierarchies, and new rules that limit direct access to God. The freedom that Jesus brought has, in many cases, been replaced by a system that resembles the old religions based on control and intermediation. The biggest example of this is the very structure of Christian churches throughout history. During the first centuries, Christ's followers lived a simple, communal faith without a rigid hierarchy. The early Christians would gather in homes, share teachings, and pray together, without the need for a physical temple or a priestly caste. But, as time went on, Christianity became institutionalized and began to rebuild the same models that Jesus had broken. The emergence of the Catholic Church brought back the idea of an exclusive priesthood, in which only a select few could administer the sacraments and interpret the scriptures. The very concept of church began to be tied to buildings, rather than to the community of the faithful, which once again created the idea that God dwelled only in specific places and not within each believer. The Middle Ages took this hierarchy to the extreme. Access to the scriptures was limited only to the clergy. Forgiveness began to be administered through indulgences, and religious power became synonymous with political control. The symbolic veil that had been torn by Jesus was gradually rebuilt by the very institution that carried his name. But this trend was not limited to Catholicism. Even with the Protestant Reformation, which introduced the idea of the universal priesthood of believers, many denominations continued to impose structures and rules that recreated barriers between God and people. Worship began to be mediated by pastors and religious leaders, creating the illusion that only those who have studied theology have the authority to teach the Word or lead the faithful to the divine presence. In today's world, we still see many modern forms of religious veils. Some churches impose rigid doctrines, determining what a person can or cannot do to be accepted by God. Others create an emotional and psychological dependence of the faithful on their leaders, replacing personal pursuit of faith with blind submission to ecclesiastical authority. There are also those that commercialize spirituality, charging for blessings, promises, and even keys to heaven, turning the relationship with God into a product to be consumed. But religions are not the only places where we see the reconstruction of the veil. Modern society, despite declaring itself more free, still imposes numerous barriers to direct connection with the divine. The overload of information, materialism, and the pursuit of external success have created distractions that distance people from reflection and genuine spirituality. Technology connects us with everything except ourselves. The modern world also promotes a new kind of priesthood, not religious but intellectual and ideological. Experts, influencers, and modern gurus have taken on the role of mediators of truth, causing many people to stop thinking for themselves and simply accept what they are taught. This is a new type of veil that prevents humanity from seeing its own spiritual freedom. If the veil has been torn, why do so many people still live as if it were intact? Because freedom is frightening. Humans often prefer to follow rules set by others rather than take responsibility for their own spiritual journey. When there is no veil separating God from men, each person must face their faith directly, without excuses, without outsourcing. The message of the torn veil is an invitation to spiritual maturity. It is a call for each individual to seek their own connection with the divine, without fear, without guilt, without the need for human approval. True faith does not depend on temples, leaders, or dogmas. It depends on a sincere heart, open to the truth. But this freedom requires courage. It requires stepping out of your comfort zone. It requires abandoning dependence on external structures and developing an intimate and authentic relationship with God. The big question that remains is, if the veil was torn, what does this mean for each one of us? How can this truth practically transform our lives? This leads us to the final and most important moment of our journey, the conclusion of this topic. The veil has been torn. The barrier has been removed. God was never far away. Only human systems created this separation. But now, in the face of this reality, the most important question of all arises. What does this mean for you? Often we talk about spirituality as an abstract concept, something that belongs to the past or to theology. But the truth of the torn veil is not just a historical event, it's an invitation to a new way of living. If Jesus removed all the barriers between you and God, then what still prevents you from living this spiritual freedom? The answer may lie within our own internal ties. The greatest veil that still needs to be torn is not physical. It's not in temples or institutions. It's in the mind and heart of each person. It's the veil of fear, guilt, feelings of unworthiness, the belief that God is distant and inaccessible. From childhood, many were taught to see God as a stern figure, a distant judge who demands perfection and adherence to rules. They were conditioned to believe that they are only accepted if they are good enough, if they follow all religious traditions, if they are approved by spiritual leaders. But this was never the message of Jesus. He came to show that God has always been accessible, that the Creator's love is not conditioned by human merits or sacrifices. He came to destroy fear and teach us to live a spirituality based on relationship, not obligation. But how many people still live as if they were trapped in a system of rules, afraid to approach God because they feel imperfect? The torn veil reminds us that there are no longer intermediaries between you and God. You don't need rituals, permissions, or rules created by men. Access is open, and it always has been. But this freedom also brings a challenge. What will you do with it? If God has already torn the veil, why do so many people still choose to live as prisoners? The answer may lie in the fact that freedom can be frightening. When there are clear rules and an established religious system, there is also security. Just follow what is written and trust that someone will bridge the gap between you and God. But when that bridge disappears, when you realize that you need to seek this connection on your own, everything changes. Now, spiritual responsibility is in your hands. This does not mean that the community or spiritual teachings are not important, but it does mean that no one can live your spirituality for you. No leader can relate to God in your place. No church can define your faith. No doctrine can limit your connection with the divine. This journey is personal, non-transferable, and unique to each individual. Jesus didn't come just to teach doctrines, he came to transform hearts. And this transformation only occurs when we understand that there is no longer a veil, there is no longer separation, there is no longer fear. So the ultimate question is, are you ready to cross the veil? Are you willing to let go of the barriers that hold you back? Are you ready to connect with God without fear, without intermediaries, without limitations imposed by human systems? Are you willing to discover that God's presence is already within you? That the true temple is not a building, but your very own being? The veil has been torn. The barrier has vanished. The presence of God has never been so accessible, so close, so available to each one of us. But now, the decision lies in your hands. Are you ready to live this truth? What impacted you the most on this journey? Do you feel there is still an invisible veil in your life, preventing you from accessing your spiritual freedom? Share your answer in the comments. Let's create a chain of reflection and awaken together. Your response is not just a comment, it's part of a movement that transforms lives. And if this secret has been kept hidden for centuries, what other truths could have been concealed from humanity? If you want to continue exploring the mysteries of early Christianity, don't leave now. The next video, The Hidden Disciples of Jesus, the secret group that kept the truth, is already on the screen for you to watch. Click now and discover the hidden followers of Jesus who kept the truth alive behind the scenes of history. See you there, mind unfettered. Blast off.